Chapter 1. The skinning begins. The torches burn low in the forgotten courtyard beneath the palace, their smoke curling like ghosts against stone walls that have witnessed too many screams. Chains rattle in the darkness, the sound echoes of ancient brick mixing with hurried footsteps and the ragged breathing of a man being dragged not toward justice, but toward something far more final. His name was once spoken with respect in the palace corridors. Now it is spat like a curse by men who never knew him, never served beside him, never stood watch through endless winter nights while threats prowled just beyond the walls. He stumbles as the guards force him forward, his knees scraping against cold stone worn smooth by centuries of blood. His armor has been stripped away, his weapons confiscated. All that remains is the man and the loyalty that will not break even now. Please, he whispers, not for mercy, but for understanding. Let me speak to him just once more. The gods do not answer. They have their orders that came from the one person in this kingdom the guard would have died to protect. Above, hidden behind a carved wooden screen threaded with silk, a figure watches the prince. His face is pale, almost translucent in the lamplight, his eyes hollow with something that might be grief or might be madness. He does not speak, he does not move, he simply watches as the executioners enter the courtyard, hooded, silent, carrying implements that gleam wet in the torchlight. The guard's eyes search the shadows, frantically, desperately seeking the face he knows is there. Your Highness, he calls out, his voice cracking. I served you faithfully. I would never silence him, comes a voice from behind the screen, cold, distant, unrecognizable. A cloth is forced into the guard's mouth. His protests dissolve into muffled cries as he is chained, spread eagle to a wooden frame positioned so that anyone watching from above would have a perfect view. The executioners move with practiced efficiency, laying out their tools in careful rows, knives of different sizes, hooks, salt, vinegar, everything needed to peel a man's loyalty away layer by layer. The head executioner approaches the guard, studying him with professional detachment, deciding where to begin. The guard's eyes are wide now, tears streaming down his face, not from fear of pain, but from the shattering realization that the boy he saved, the prince he protected, the man he loved like a brother, has condemned him to this. Behind the screen, the prince's hand trembles as it grips the carved lattice. The executioner raises his blade, angling it carefully against the guard's shoulder. The torchlight catches the edge for one suspended moment. The entire courtyard holds its breath. The guards, the executioners, the hidden prince, and the loyal man about to be destroyed by the very loyalty that defined him. The blade descends, and we cut to black. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, how devotion became betrayal, how trust became torture, we must go back to a kingdom tearing itself apart from within, to a court where loyalty was the rarest and most dangerous currency of all. Chapter 2. A kingdom on edge. The realm was dying, though no one would dare speak it aloud. King Aldrich III sat his throne like a corpse, propped upright by ceremony and fear, his hands trembling with palsy, his mind clouded by age and the countless poisons his physicians insisted were medicine. He had ruled for 43 years, long enough to watch his enemies grow old and his friends grow treacherous. Now, in the winter of his reign, the court circled him like vultures, each faction sharpening its claws, waiting for the moment to strike. In the east wing, the dukes men whispered of succession. In the south tower, the church plotted spiritual coups disguised as moral guidance. In the shadowed alcoves of the treasury, merchants and foreign ambassadors made promises written in coin and sealed with blackmail, and in the center of it, all caught between father and throne, was the prince. Prince Thildrick was not meant for this. He had been the third son, the spare until plague took his eldest brother and war claimed the second. Suddenly, unexpectedly, he was heir to a kingdom he had never been trained to rule, surrounded by advisors who smiled with their mouths and schemed with their eyes. He was 24 years old and utterly alone, except for one man. The guard had no grand title, no noble lineage. Stretching back to the first kings, his family held a minor estate on the kingdom's edge, the kind of place where loyalty meant something because survival demanded it. His father had served in the king's guard, until an arrow took him during a border skirmish. His mother raised him on stories of duty, honor, and the sacred bond between protector and protected. When he came to the capital at 17, broad-shouldered and earnest, the court sneered he lacked the polish of palace-born knights, the refined cruelty that passed for sophistication among the nobility. He couldn't quote ancient poetry, or navigate the intricate dances of political favor, but he could fight, and more importantly, he could be trusted in a palace where trust was currency more valuable than gold, where every whispered conversation might be a trap, and every smile concealed a blade. This quality marked him as either invaluable or impossibly naive, perhaps both. He rose through the ranks not because he sought power, but because he simply did his duty. When other guards drank themselves stupid or took bribes to look the other way, he stood his post. When conspirators approached him with offers gold land titles, he reported them. When the prince, newly elevated and drowning in responsibility, needed someone to stand at his door while enemies prowled the halls, the captain appointed him. It was meant to be a temporary assignment. It became everything. The kingdom's rot ran deeper than any single faction or conspiracy. The treasury was hollow, drained by decades of mismanagement and corruption. The military was fragmented. Generals owing loyalty to patrons rather than crown. The provinces were restless, seeing weakness at the center and sensing opportunity. Foreign powers watched with hungry eyes, ready to exploit the chaos of succession. And in this powder keg of ambition and desperation, one simple, honest guard became something neither he nor anyone else anticipated. The one person the future king trusted absolutely. This trust, pure and uncomplicated in a world of Byzantine manipulation, would mark him for destruction, because in a court where everyone wore masks, a man without one was not admirable, he was dangerous. And those who trade in lies and secrets know that nothing threatens their power more than someone who speaks truth to those who make decisions. The guard didn't understand this. He thought loyalty was its own shield. He believed that devotion once given and returned could not be broken. He was wrong. The forces gathering against him moved in shadows, patient and methodical. They understood what he did not, that the prince's trust in him was not his strength. It was his death sentence. Chapter 3. The guard's devotion, the bond between them, was forged in blood and terror on a winter night, when the prince was still learning what it meant to be hunted. It was 3 months after Prince Theodoric's brothers died, 3 months into his sudden unwanted elevation to heir. The assassination attempts had already begun. Poisoning wine, a loosened saddle strap, a bandit attack that targeted only the prince's carriage. Each time the conspirators withdrew, testing defenses, probing for weakness. The night they came in earnest, the guard was making his rounds. He heard it first, the wrong kind of silence, the absence of sounds that should have been there. The 2 sentries posted outside the prince's chambers were missing, not replaced, not reassigned, simply gone. His hand went to his sword as he quickened his pace, boots echoing too loud in the empty corridor. The prince's door stood ajar. Inside, 4 figures in unmarked black moved with professional efficiency. One held a pillow approaching the bed where the prince slept, exhausted from another day of impossible demands and veiled threats. Another positioned himself by the window, escape route secured. The third kept watch at the door. The fourth held a blade that gleamed even in darkness, the kind of blade that left wounds. Poison would pour into. The guard didn't hesitate, didn't call for help that might not come in time, didn't pause to calculate odds or consider his own survival. He simply moved his sword, cleared its sheath as he crashed through the door, the sudden violence of his entry scattering the assassin's careful choreography. The watchman turned too slow. The guard's blade took him across the throat, arterial spray painting the wall. The prince jerked awake, confused, as the guard positioned himself between the bed and the remaining killers. 3 against 1, professionals against a single guard who'd grown up fighting border raiders, not trained assassins. The mathematics were simple and brutal. He bought time with pain. A knife opened his shoulder as he blocked a strike meant for the prince's heart. He shattered the blade wielder's knee, but took a dagger between his ribs for it. The one with the pillow threw it aside and drew a second weapon, circling, looking for an opening, while the guard bled and the prince scrambled for a weapon. They might have finished, it might have killed them both. Except the guard did something unexpected. Instead of defending, he attacked, driving forward despite his wounds, forcing the assassins back toward the window. One stumble, the guard's blade found his spine. The last assassin, seeing the mission collapsing and palace guards finally responding to the commotion, made the choice all professionals make. He chose to survive, disappearing through the window into the night. The guard collapsed, blood pooling beneath him, thinking his last thoughts would be wondering if age done enough. He woke 3 days later to find the prince sitting beside his bed, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, hands clenched, white-knuckled with relief and something deeper, gratitude, yes, but also the desperate, drowning realization that this guard, this simple, honest man, was the only person in the entire kingdom who had proven willing to die for him, not out of ambition or duty, but something the prince had nearly forgotten existed: simple human loyalty. "You saved my life," the prince whispered, the guard, still weak from blood loss, managed a smile. "My duty, your highness." No, the prince's voice cracked. "It was more than duty. You could have called for help. You could have run. You stood between me and death when you had every reason not to." From that night forward, the guard became more than protection. He became confidant, brother in everything. But blood, the one person the prince could speak to without filtering every word through layers of political calculation. When the weight of the crown to come threatened to crush him, the prince would find the guard at his post and simply talk about nothing, about everything, about the impossible burden of ruling when everyone around you sees you as either tool or obstacle. The guard never offered grand political advice. He simply listened, and in listening, without judgment or agenda, he gave the prince something irreplaceable, a refuge from the performance of power. The court noticed. How could they not? The prince, who trusted no one, trusted this guard absolutely. Advisors found their counsel weighed against the guard's simple observations. Nobles discovered that their schemes required navigating not just political networks, but one honest man's quiet influence. They resented him for it, feared him for it, and finally decided to destroy him for it, because the guard failed to understand a fundamental truth about courts and power: that being loved by a prince is dangerous, but being trusted by him is fatal. Trust cannot be bought, cannot be manipulated, cannot be controlled. And in a world built on manipulation and control, the uncontrollable must be eliminated. The guard believed his loyalty was his armor. It was actually the target painted on his back. Chapter 4: Conspiracies. In the shadows, the first whisper came from the duke's household, planted carefully during a feast where wine flowed freely and tongues loosened. "Have you noticed?" a minor lordling mentioned casually to his dinner companion, ensuring his voice carried just far enough. "How the prince seeks the guard's counsel before his own advisors. Strange, isn't he? A common soldier wielding such influence." The comment hung in the air, like smoke drifting from table to table, growing more substantial with each retelling. By morning, it had become: the guard controls the prince, makes all his decisions for him. The second whisper emerged from the church's quarter, wrapped in concern and righteousness. "We worry for his highness's soul," the bishop confided to the king's chamberlain, his tone heavy with manufactured worry. "This guard whispers poison in his ear, turning him from his father, from tradition, from God's proper order. That the prince grows distant, rebellious. One wonders what influence corrupts him so." The third whisper was more direct, more dangerous. "Forged documents passed between merchants and foreign agents, letters supposedly written in the guard's hand, detailing plans, alliances, promises. When the old king falls, these fabrications read: we move, the prince will be our instrument, and I will be the hand that wields him." The guard knew nothing of these machinations. He stood his post, did his duty, lived his simple life of service. He noticed the changed atmosphere. The way conversation stopped when he entered rooms, the cold glances from nobles who once ignored him, but attributed it to court politics. He didn't understand and didn't wish to. The prince noticed too, but his reaction was different, darker. The assassination attempt had planted seeds of paranoia that advisors now carefully watered. Every stumble, every setback, every piece of bad news came with subtle suggestions. Perhaps information is being leaked. Someone close to you must be providing intelligence to your enemies. Trust your highness is a weapon they will use against you. The Duke's faction moved with surgical precision, exploiting the prince's growing isolation and fear. They fabricated a servant's testimony. The poor woman poured with threats to her family, claiming she'd seen the guard meeting with foreign agents. They arranged for coded messages to be discovered in the guards' quarters, planted by paid accomplices and found by investigators who served their patrons. Not truth, the evidence mounted like stones on a grave. Each piece was false, but together they built something that resembled truth to a mind already cracking under pressure. The guard first learned something was wrong when his access was restricted. No explanation, just new orders. He would no longer stand direct watch over the prince's chambers. He was reassigned to outer patrols, moved to night shifts, gradually, methodically separated from the man-aged sworn to protect. He requested an audience with the prince, denied. He wrote letters unanswered. He felt the walls closing in, but couldn't see them, couldn't identify the hands pushing them inward. Then came the meeting. He wasn't supposed to overhear. The guard on patrol beneath the council chamber's windows when voices carried through the ventilation crates. The Duke, the bishop, and two advisors the prince had come to rely on. The guard must be dealt with soon. The Duke's voice calm and cold. The prince wavers. He suspects our reports, but doesn't yet believe. We need something undeniable, an overt act of treason. Stage an attack. Another voice suggested. Attribute it to the guards network. When the prince faces death again, he'll believe anything. The bishop. And if the guard interferes, if he somehow protects the prince again. A pause. Then the Duke, with the casual cruelty of someone moving chess pieces. Then we ensure the prince believes the guard orchestrated the attack to create an opportunity for a rescue. Either way, he becomes the villain. The guard's blood ran cold. They were planning to kill the prince, or make it appear so, and frame him for it. Every word of service, every moment of loyalty, every time H bled for this man would be twisted into evidence of betrayal. He had to warn. The prince had to get to him before the conspirators could execute their plan. But H been locked out, cut off, isolated precisely to prevent this. That night, he broke protocol. He abandoned his post and forced his way into the prince's private wing, overpowering guards who'd been told he was dangerous. Desperate to reach the one person who might still listen, he burst into the prince's study, breathing hard, eyes wild, and found Prince Theodoric surrounded by the very advisors plotting his destruction. Your Highness, the guard gasped. You're in danger. The Duke, the bishop, they plan to seize him. The prince said quietly, his voice empty. The guard froze. Your Highness. The prince finally looked at him, and the guard's heart broke at what he saw in those eyes. Not trust, not gratitude, not even anger, just exhausted, defeated suspicion. I know about your meetings, the prince said, reciting the lies H been fed, the letters, the payments. I know you've been using my trust to undermine me, to position yourself as my handler while you sell me piece by piece to my enemies. No, the guard whispered. No, it's them. They're lying to you. I would never. You forced your way past my guards. You're here now raving about plots and dangers. Exactly what a guilty man would do when cornered. The prince's voice cracked. You were the one person I trusted, the only one, and it was all a performance. Please, the guard begged as palace soldiers grabbed his arms. Please, just listen. But the prince had already turned away, shoulders shaking, unable to watch as the man H loved like a brother was dragged from the room behind him. The Duke placed a comforting hand on the prince's shoulder, hiding his smile. The trap had closed perfectly. Chapter 5. The prince unravels. 3 days passed before the prince entered the interrogation chambers, 3 days during which the guard was held in darkness, neither tortured nor questioned, simply left alone with his thoughts and the sound of other prisoners screaming. When the door finally opened, the prince stood silhouetted against torchlight, his face hidden in shadow. Aged years in those 3 days, thin, hollow, haunted. Confess, he said quietly, and I'll make it quick, painless. You'll simply disappear. No trial, no public execution, just gone. The guard chained to the wall looked up at the boy because that's what he still was beneath the title, and terror, and felt something break inside him, not his resolve, not his loyalty, but his hope that truth might still matter. I have nothing to confess, your highness. I served you faithfully. I still serve you even here. Don the prince's voice sharpened. Don't perform loyalty now. The evidence was fabricated. The guard's voice remained steady despite his desperation. Every letter, every testimony, every piece of proof, they showed you lies designed to separate us, because as long as you trusted me, you had someone who told you truth, and truth is what they fear most. The prince wanted to believe him God how he wanted to. But the weight of evidence, the careful construction of the conspiracy, the unanimous certainty of all his advisers, how could they all be lying? How could this guard, this one man, be the only truthful voice? They'll kill you, the guard continued, urgency rising. The assassination isn't cancelled, it's postponed. Once I'm gone, once you have no one you truly trust, they'll move. The Duke wants your throne. The bishop wants control of your soul. The foreign agents want your kingdom weak and ripe for conquest. I'm not your enemy. I'm the only barrier between you and them. For a moment, one flickering fragile moment, doubt crossed the prince's face. The paranoia that had been so carefully cultivated warred with the memories of a man who'd taken blades meant for him, who'd bled protecting him, who'd never asked for anything but the honor of service. Then the Duke's voice came from the doorway, smooth and concerned. Your highness, you shouldn't be here. Let the interrogators handle this. They have experience extracting truth from traitors. The moment shattered. The prince's face hardened again, retreating behind the walls. His fear had built make him confess. He told the Duke, not looking at the guard, whatever it takes. As the prince left, the guard called after him one last time. I forgive you, Theodoric. Whatever happens, I forgive you. And when they come for you, remember I tried to warn you. Remember I loved you like a brother. The door slammed shut. The prince stood outside, shaking, as the Duke summoned the interrogators, professional men with professional tools, and no investment in truth, only in breaking the human body, until words poured out, any words true or false. Whatever words would make the pain stop. They started with dislocations, shoulders, fingers, toes. Sharp, precise pain designed to shatter without killing. The guard screamed but confessed nothing. They moved to Brand's heated iron pressed against flesh, the smell of burning skin filling the chamber. The guard wept, but confessed nothing. Above in his chambers, the prince heard the screams through the stone, and paced like a caged animal, clutching his head, trying to silence the voice in his mind that whispered he was wrong, that he was destroying the one good thing in his rotten world. The interrogators sent word the prisoner would not break. Then used the fear the Duke advised, his voice kind, paternal, poisonous. Describe what awaits if he continues to resist. Sometimes imagination accomplishes what pain cannot. So they told the guard what came next if he didn't confess. They described flaying in clinical detail, the knives, the technique, the precise order of cuts that would keep him conscious as long as possible. They explained how skin would be peeled from muscle, how salt would be applied to raw flesh, how he would beg for death long before it arrived. Confess, they urged almost gently. Say you betrayed him, say you planned to usurp him. Give us the words, and we'll kill you clean. No one needs to know you died loyal, just say the words. The guard looked at them with eyes swollen from beating through, lips split and bleeding, and said, I cannot confess to lies, not even to escape this, because if I do, the prince will believe the betrayal was real. Hell trust no one ever again, and hell walk into their trap with no one to warn him. Then you doom yourself, the chief interrogator said without emotion. The prince has ordered flaying for your treason. You'll die a traitor's death. No, the guard whispered, closing his eyes. He'll die a guard's death, protecting my prince until the very end, even if he can see it. When they reported his refusal to confess, the prince broke. He shattered furniture, screamed accusations at walls, tore at his own hair. The guard's continued denial felt like mockery, like cruelty. If he was innocent, he would confess to save himself. If he was guilty, he would confess to receive mercy. This refusal, this martyrdom could only be manipulation, the final, most painful betrayal. Do it, the prince finally said, hollow and Broken carry out the sentence. Ill watch, ill see his face when he finally admits the truth. The Duke smiled in the shadows. Everything was proceeding as planned. In the guard's death, the prince's isolation would be complete, and an isolated prince was a controllable prince. They prepared the courtyard, gathered the tools, set the torches, and brought the guard, still loyal, still broken-hearted, still refusing to curse the prince who condemned him to face a death reserved for the vilest traitors. Above, hidden behind silk and shame, the prince watched, waiting for the confession that would justify this horror. It would never come. Chapter 6. The torture chamber below the forgotten courtyard beneath the palace had witnessed 3 centuries of secrets die in darkness, built during the reign of the Second Dynasty, when enemies were plentiful and mercy was a luxury no king could afford. It existed in no official plans appeared in no architectural records. Guards who served here signed away their tongues through silence, or had them cut out literally. What happened in this space remained in this space, buried beneath stone and screams. The guard was brought down through passages that wound like intestines through the palace's foundations, each turn taking him deeper, further from light and hope and anything resembling mercy. His wrists were raw from the iron cuffs that had held him during days of preliminary torture. His body was a map of pain burns, cuts, shattered fingers that had healed wrong because no one bothered setting them. But his eyes, swollen and darkened, still held something the interrogators found infuriating: dignity. The frame they chained him to was ancient oak, dark with the dried blood of countless others who'd occupied this same position, spread eagle, unable to collapse, even when strength failed, positioned perfectly for the watchers above, for the prince hidden behind his screen, who needed to see everything to believe anything. The executioners were brothers, inheritors of a profession passed down through generations. Their family had served the crown for 200 years, their expertise in extracting maximum pain while maintaining consciousness becoming legend whispered in courts across the continent. They worked in silence, laying out their instruments with the care of surgeons, knives of varying lengths and curves, each designed for specific depths and angles, hooks for pulling away skin, ones separated needles for temporary closures that prolonged the process, salts and vinegars that would ignite severed nerves into new agonies. Last chance, the chief interrogator offered, reading from a script the Duke had prepared. Confess your treason, name your CEO. Conspirators die clean. The guard's voice emerged, hoarse from screaming during earlier sessions, but steady. I have no treason to confess. I served faithfully. I die faithfully. May God forgive those who engineered this lie behind the screen. The prince flinched at the word lie, but said nothing. H come this far, turn back now would mean accepting that H tortured an innocent man, destroyed the one person who truly loved him. The human mind can endure almost anything except that particular flavor of guilt. So the prince told himself this was performance manipulation, the guard's final attempt at psychological warfare. He nodded to the interrogator. The sentence would proceed. The lead executioner approached, studying the guard's body with professional assessment, deciding where to begin. The traditional method started at the extremities, fingers, toes, working inward, but this was no traditional execution. This was punishment theater, a message. They began at the shoulder where the guard had taken his first wound, protecting the prince years ago. The scar was still visible, a pale line across darker skin. The executioner placed his blade there, almost gently letting the guard feel the cold metal. Before cutting, the first incision was shallow, technical, separating the outer layer of skin from the fat and fascia beneath. Blood welled, but didn't pour. The cut was too controlled for that. The guard's breath hissed through clenched teeth, his body rigid against the chains. He would not scream, not yet, wouldn't give them that satisfaction, but the human body has limits, and the executioners knew precisely where those limits lived as the blade worked deeper, as the hooked instruments began their terrible work of separation, as the guard's skin began to peel away from muscle like parchment from wood. The screams came raw, animal. The sound a human makes when the self, the boundary between inside and outside, the literal skin that defines us, is violated in the most fundamental way. Above, the prince pressed his fist against his mouth, tasting blood where he bit through his lip. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The guard's screams weren't the screams of a guilty man finally breaking. They were the screams of betrayal, of a loyal heart being literally torn apart, while the one aged died to protect watched from hiding. "Stop," the prince whispered, but no one heard him stop. He said louder, but the executioners were deep in their work, now focused entirely on the technical demands of their craft. "Stop." He screamed, stumbling from behind the screen, and finally, the brothers paused, turning to see the prince, revealed tears streaming down his face, reaching toward the guard with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. The guard, barely conscious, raised his head. His eyes found the prince's, and in that moment, there was no anger, no accusation, only sorrow for what the prince had become, for what they both lost, for a bond destroyed by fear and manipulation. The guard gasped through the haze of pain, using his last coherent moments to do what aged always done: protect his prince. The Duke plans 3 days from now, during the treaty signing assassination, dressed as an accident. They'll blame foreign agencies, emergency powers, control you or kill you. And his voice failed. Blood loss and shock were winning. The executioners looked to the prince for instruction: continue or cease. But the prince had frozen, the guard's words cutting through paranoia and manipulation like a blade through silk. 3 days from now, the treaty signing. Been told the guard had Confederates planning something during that exact event, told by the Duke, who'd insisted on controlling security personally, who'd systematically removed every guard loyal to the prince and replaced them with his own men. The conspiracy wasn't against him by the guard. It was against them both, and only one of them had seen it clearly. Theodoric, the guard whispered, using the prince's name for the first time in years, abandoning protocol in his final moments. "I forgive you, brother. I forgive you. Stop them, life, please." His head fell forward, his breathing grew shallow. The prince screamed wordless anguish, the sound of a soul shattering, and ran to the frame, pulling at chains with his bare hands, trying to free the man aged just murdered. But it was too late. The guard's chest rose once more, fell, and did not rise again. His eyes remained open, fixed on the prince, carrying their message into whatever came after: forgiveness and warning, love and tragedy, all mixed together in the particular horror of preventable grief. The prince collapsed, clinging to the corpse of the only brother aged ever had, finally understanding what aged done, what they'd made him do, what aged allowed to happen through his own fear and weakness. The Duke appeared at the chamber entrance, expression perfectly crafted into surprise and concern. "Your Highness, what are you doing here? You shouldn't see such things. Come, let us." "You did this," the prince whispered, not moving from the guard's body. "All of this. You turned me into a murderer. You destroyed the one good thing in my life." "Your Highness is distraught." "The traitor's manipulations." "Get out!" The prince's scream echoed of stone walls. "All of you get out. Leave me with what I've done." They retreated, because even the Duke knew there were moments when a prince's command carried weight beyond politics. But as they climbed the stairs back toward the palace proper, the Duke was already calculating next moves. The guard was dead, the prince was broken, the treaty signing in 3 days would proceed as planned, and a broken prince was almost as useful as a dead one. In the chamber below, the prince held the guard's body and wept, finally understanding that loyalty, true, pure, uncomplicated loyalty, was the rarest treasure in his kingdom. And he had just murdered it with his own hands at the urging of men who smiled while they destroyed him piece by piece. The guard had died protecting him one final time, using his last breath to warn him of the warning bought with such terrible suffering would mean anything at all. Chapter 7 Flayed for loyalty. The body remained in the chamber for hours while the prince grieved in darkness. No one dared disturb him. Above, the palace moved through its routines, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in its forgotten depths. Servants prepared for the treaty signing, nobles jockeyed for position. The Duke met with his conspirators, confirming final details of an assassination that would reshape the kingdom. When the prince finally emerged, he was transformed. The paranoid, uncertain boy who descended those stairs was gone. In his place stood something harder, colder, a man who'd murdered innocents and found himself reborn in guilt. Arrest the Duke were his first words to the captain of the guard and the bishop and every advisor who convinced me of the guard's treason. Arrest them all. The captain, hand picked by the Duke himself, hesitated just long enough to reveal his loyalties. The prince's sword cleared its sheath before the man could speak, taking him through the throat. Not a princely killing, no elegance or ceremony, just brutal, efficient violence from someone who'd finally learned that mercy shown to vipers only gets you bitten. Who else? The prince asked the remaining guards, his sword still dripping. Who else serves the Duke over the crown? In the chaos that followed, the prince learned the depth of the conspiracy. 2/3 of the palace guard answered to the Duke, most of the treasury officials, several military commanders. The rot had spread so deep that excising it might kill the kingdom as surely as letting it remain. But the prince was past caring about kingdoms. H murdered his brother for lies. Nothing else mattered beside that sin. The Duke, warned by his network, attempted to flee. He made it as far as the stables before the prince caught him personally. No guards or intermediaries, just raw vengeance in human form. What happened in those stables left even hardened soldiers pale when they discovered the aftermath. The bishop fared slightly better, granted a trial before his execution, not because the prince felt merciful, but because he wanted the conspirators' methods exposed, their techniques laid bare, so future princes might recognize the weapons used against him. The trial revealed everything: the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the careful psychological manipulation that had turned the prince's protective paranoia into a weapon against the one person who deserved his trust. Transcripts of the conspirators' meetings were read aloud. The servant who'd lied about the guards' meetings broke down, confessing she'd been threatened with her children's lives. The merchant who'd written the false letters admitted H been paid in gold and promised monopolies. The truth, when finally assembled, was so clear, so obvious that the prince could barely comprehend how H been blind to it. Every warning sign had been visible, every piece of evidence had been theatrical. The guard had never wavered, never compromised, never done anything except serve faithfully, and the prince had tortured him to death for it. The executions of the conspirators brought no satisfaction. The prince attended each one, forcing himself to watch, but felt nothing except the hollow space where his heart used to be. Justice couldn't resurrect the dead, vengeance couldn't undo what H done. He ordered the guard buried with full honors, a funeral fit for a prince's brother, complete with ceremonies and monuments. But he couldn't bring himself to attend, couldn't face the guard's mother who traveled from her estate to bury her son, couldn't hear the eulogies praising loyalty and sacrifice without seeing the torture chamber, smelling the blood, hearing the screams. The guard's final warning proved accurate. Among the Duke's papers, investigators found the complete assassination plan scheduled for the treaty signing. Without the guard's dying words, the prince would have walked into a crossbow bolt, disguised as a foreign agent's attack. The Duke's men would have seized power in the ensuing chaos. The bishop would have legitimized their rule through religious authority, and the prince would have been mourned as a tragic martyr while his killers claimed his throne. The guard had saved him, even while dying from the prince's own cruelty. It was this realization that loyalty persisted even through betrayal, that love survived even torture, that finally broke what remained of the prince's mind. Chapter 8. The palace consumed. The prince ruled for 7 months after the guard's death, 7 months of increasing instability, of decisions made in grief and guilt rather than wisdom, of a kingdom slowly disintegrating under a monarch who'd lost his capacity for trust without the conspiracy to unite against. The court's factions resumed their endless wars. Without the Duke to coordinate opposition, resistance became fragmented, but more violent. Without the guard to provide honest counsel, the prince surrounded himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear, which was nothing, because the prince wanted nothing except his dead friend's forgiveness. The treaty signing proceeded under massive security, but the foreign dignitaries saw a prince barely present, eyes distant, hands trembling. They reported to their courts that the kingdom was vulnerable, its ruler broken, invasions were planned, trade embargoes implemented, the vultures began circling The old king died 3 months after the guard's execution, collapsing during dinner, though whether from age or poison, no one could definitively say. The prince ascended to full kingship in a coronation. He barely attended, mentally going through the motions while his mind remained in that underground chamber watching his brother die. Without the guard's stabilizing presence, the prince, now king, cycled through advisors, weakly trusting none, listening to few. Policies contradicted each other, military commands were issued and retracted. The economy, already fragile, began to collapse as merchants and nobles lost confidence in the throne's stability. But the worst damage was internal. The new king claimed to see the guard everywhere, standing at doorways where aged ones kept watch, in corridors where they talked through long nights, in the training yards where the guard had taught him to sword fight properly without the formal rigidity of palace instructors. Palace servants whispered that His Majesty spoke to empty air, having conversations with ghosts. The royal physicians called it grief. The priests called it divine punishment. The king himself called it nothing because he no longer spoke about it at all, withdrawing deeper into silence and isolation. The conspirators, the Duke, had worked with those who'd escaped initial arrests, saw their opportunity. Without the Duke's central authority, they formed a coalition of convenience. Military commanders owed loyalty to regional nobles, treasury officials embezzled frantically before the kingdom collapsed completely. Foreign agents worked openly to destabilize what remained. They launched their coup 6 months after the guard's death. Not an assassination. The king's death would create a succession crisis they couldn't control. Instead, they simply took power around him, issuing orders in his name, while keeping him isolated in the palace, a puppet king who barely noticed his strings. The king offered no resistance. When the commanders informed him that military authority had been transferred to a joint council, he simply nodded. When the treasury announced austerity measures that exempted noble estates, he signed without reading. When foreign treaties were signed surrendering sovereign territory, he didn't ask what was being given away. H stopped caring about the kingdom the moment he murdered the one person who'd cared about him. The final meeting of the king's abbreviated reign occurred in the throne room, when the coalition's leaders formally requested he abdicate in favor of a regency council. It was a polite fiction. He had no power to abdicate or retain, but they wanted the legitimacy of his voluntary surrender. The king sat on his throne, thin and pale, aged decades in months, and finally spoke. The guard warned me in his last moments, with his skin flayed from his body. He warned me you would come. He used his dying breath to protect me. And he couldn't finish. The words dissolved into weeping that embarrassed everyone present. The coalition leaders exchanged glances, confirmed their suspicions that the king had lost his mind, and proceeded with their plans regardless. Your Majesty need not concern himself with such matters anymore, the senior general said, not unkindly. Well handle the kingdom's burdens. You should rest, recover, perhaps retire to the country estate where the air is clearer. It was a gentler imprisonment than most opposed monarchs received, and the king accepted it without argument. He was escorted from the throne room, not roughly but firmly, and taken to a country manor surrounded by guards who called themselves his security detail. He would never return to the capital. The kingdom, aged inherited, fell apart over the following years, carved out by the coalition's competing interests, eventually fragmenting into 3 separate territories controlled by former noble houses. But the king, exiled in his country manor, noticed none of this. He spent his remaining days writing endless letters to a dead man, explaining, apologizing, begging for forgiveness. He knew would never come. The letters were never sent. They piled up in his study, thousands of pages of guilt and regret and love, admitted to late 3 years after the guard's execution. A servant found the king dead at his desk, another unfinished letter under his hand. The cause was officially recorded as heart failure. In truth, it was simply the final collapse of a man who died the day he murdered his only friend. The letter, his last, contained only one sentence, repeated over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Chapter 9, A Legacy of Regret. The story should have ended there, with a broken king dying alone, unmourned by a kingdom that barely remembered him. But history has a way of preserving what we'd rather forget, especially when that preservation serves someone's purpose 20 years after the king's death. A court historian working in the royal archives discovered a sealed collection of documents marked with the late king's personal seal. The historian had been commissioned by the current regime's successors to the coalition that had deposed the king to write an official history legitimizing their rule. What he found instead complicated that narrative considerably. The cache contained the king's private journals spanning his entire adult life. The early entries showed a young prince struggling with sudden responsibility, isolated and afraid, until the arrival of a guard who became his anchor. Page after page documented their growing bond, the prince's dependence on the guard's counsel, his terror of losing the one person he trusted. Then the entries grew darker. The prince's paranoia, carefully cultivated by the duke's faction, bled across pages, fears and suspicions, each one planted so skillfully that the prince believed them his own thoughts. The historian, reading with the clarity of hindsight, could trace the manipulation with almost surgical precision. How each piece of false evidence was introduced, how the prince's resistance was worn down, how isolation and fear were weaponized. The entries describing the torture and execution were almost illegible, the prince's handwriting dissolving into chaos. But one passage stood out, written the night after the guard's death. I have murdered innocents with my own hands. The duke, the bishop, all of them. They wielded me like a blade against the one person who deserved my protection. I see now how it was done, how they separated us, turned my love into suspicion, made me their weapon. But understanding changes nothing. I am guilty. The execution was my order, the torture was my command. That he forgave me with his dying breath only makes it worse. I don't deserve forgiveness. I deserve what I gave him. Betrayal, pain and death. But I am too cowardly, even for that. I will live, and living will be my punishment, because every breath reminds me of his last one, screaming my name, warning me even as I killed him. The later journals were even more disturbing. The deposed king wrote of dreams where the god appeared not angry or vengeful, but sad, endlessly, cosmically sad. He wrote of conversations with the dead man, debates about loyalty and trust, and whether love could survive what they'd been through. He wrote of plans to join the guard in death, only to stop himself, because he would want me to live to fix what I broke. And I cannot even do that. But it was the final section of the documents that changed the historian's understanding completely. Hidden at the bottom of the sealed chest was a thin folder of papers, and on its cover, in the late king's handwriting, the truth about the guard's death. Inside were confessions not from the king, but extracted from conspirators before their executions. The historian found testimony revealing that the assassination plot had been even larger than the public trials disclosed. The duke's network had extended into foreign courts, coordinated with enemy nations to destabilize the kingdom. The guard had uncovered fragments of this greater conspiracy, which was precisely why he needed to be eliminated before he assembled the complete picture. More disturbing were the medical reports from the guard's autopsy, suppressed at the time because they contradicted the narrative of his treason. The guard's body showed evidence of torture preceding the official interrogations, older wounds healed or healing, suggesting he'd been targeted and harmed before his arrest. Someone had been trying to kill or intimidate him for months, and H never reported it, perhaps not wanting to worry the prince, perhaps knowing his reports would be intercepted by the duke's network. H died protecting a prince who'd been manipulated into murdering him, while already dying from earlier attempts to silence him. The layers of tragedy were almost incomprehensible. But the most haunting document was a letter never sent, sealed and tucked among the confessions, written by the king in the final week of his life. It was addressed to the guard's mother, who had died 2 years earlier. Madame, I know you are beyond my words, now resting with your son in whatever peace that just find after this world's cruelties. But I must write this, if only to say it once before I join you both, though I expect a far different destination awaits me. Your son was everything his killers claimed. He was not loyal, honest, brave and good. I say his killers, not his executioner. Because while I gave the order and watched him die, I was merely the instrument of those who orchestrated his destruction. This is not absolution. I am guilty beyond any forgiveness. That you should know your son died a martyr's death, sacrificed not to treason, but to his own integrity. In a world that could not tolerate such dangerous honesty, he saved my life more times, and the official records show, once with his sword against assassins, 100 times with his counsel against my own worst instincts, and finally with his dying breath warning me of the conspiracy that would have killed me. Days later I survived because he died. I wear a crown purchased with his flayed skin. I have spent these years trying to understand how I could do what I did to someone I loved. The only answer I've found is that fear is a better weapon than any blade, because it makes us destroy ourselves from within. The Duke and his conspirators didn't kill your son. They made me kill him, which destroyed us both and left them free to claim the ruins. Your son forgave me in his final moments. I heard him say it. I felt the grace in those words, though I could not accept it then and cannot now, because forgiveness requires believing in redemption. And I am unredeemable. The best I can offer is this testimony: your son was the finest man I ever knew, and I was the worst thing that ever happened to him. When you see him again, please don't tell him I'm sorry. He knows, he always knew. Instead, tell him what I should have said when he stood at my door each night: that I loved him, that he was my brother in everything but blood, that my life had meaning only because he was in it. I am dying now, not from disease, but from the weight of living. With what I've done, I welcome death, not because I believe in heavenly reunion. Men like me don't get those, but because at least in death I cannot cause more harm to those I love. Your son deserved better than me. You deserved better than a letter written too late to matter. The kingdom deserved better than the ruin I've made. I am sorry for all of it, for every moment after the one where I should have believed him over his accusers. May God grant you both peace, since I destroyed any chance of it in life. Lord King of nothing, murderer of everything that mattered. The historian sat in the archives for hours after reading this, unsure what to do with information that complicated the official narrative so completely. The regime that commissioned his history wanted the late king portrayed as weak and paranoid, justifying their own seizure of power. This correspondence showed a man driven mad by manipulation and guilt, a victim as much as a perpetrator. But it also showed the conspiracy's depth, the foreign involvement, and the ways the current regime's founders had profited from destabilizing their own kingdom. Publishing the truth might cost the historian his position, possibly his life. He published it anyway. The resulting scandal shook the already fragmented territories. The coalition government tried to suppress the documents claiming forgery, but too many copies had already circulated. The public learned what had been done to their king, to the god, to the kingdom itself by those now claiming legitimate authority. It didn't restore the kingdom that was decades dead, but it restored something else: the god's name. Within a generation, he became a symbol of loyalty, betrayed of truth, murdered by conspiracy, of the innocent, destroyed by politics. Songs were written, plays performed. His grave, once unmarked after the king's allies lost power, became a site of pilgrimage. The late king's reputation remained complicated. Murderer and victim, perpetrator and puppet. History couldn't forgive what H done, but it could understand how H been weaponized against his own better nature. And in the archives preserved for whatever historians came after the pile of unsent letters, remain thousands of pages of a man talking to his dead brother, trying to explain the inexplicable, apologize for the unforgivable, and find meaning in a tragedy that had none. The last letter, the one found under his hand when he died, was eventually put on display in what remained of the Royal Museum. Visitors could see the final line repeated until the ink ran dry, and the hand could write no more. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. History rarely forgives, but sometimes centuries Later, it finally understands. Chapter 10 echoes through time. The story of the prince and his guard has echoed through 5 centuries, now retold in different forms, reinterpreted by each monster. His paranoia pathological and inexcusable. Sometimes the conspiracy becomes the real villain, absolving both men of responsibility for what they became. All these interpretations miss the point. The truth, the uncomfortable, unromantic truth, is that the guard and the prince were simply human. The guard's loyalty, while admirable, included the blindness that comes from loving someone too completely to see their flaws. The prince's paranoia, while manipulated, grew from real fears in a genuinely dangerous world. The conspiracy, while evil, was composed of individuals who believed they were protecting the kingdom from an unstable heir by taking power from someone clearly unfit to wield it. Everyone in this tragedy believed they were right, everyone had reasons, and everyone contributed to a catastrophe that destroyed them all. This is what makes the story endure, not because its unusual courts throughout history are littered with betrayals, executions, and manipulations far worse than this, but because it asks questions we still can't answer. How do you trust in a world where trust can be weaponized? How do you protect yourself without becoming paranoid? How do you remain loyal when loyalty becomes destructive? How do you forgive yourself for destroying what you loved most? The Guard's memorial, rebuilt 3 times as territories changed hands, carries an inscription supposedly composed by the late king. Though scholars debate its authenticity, it reads, "Here lies a guard who needed no monument, having built his legacy in a prince's heart. That the prince destroyed this legacy through fear and manipulation does not diminish what was built, only what was lost. May those who come after learn what the prince learned too late, that loyalty freely given is the rarest treasure, and destroying it for imagined security purchases only real ruin beside it." Added generations later stands a smaller memorial to the prince turned king, its inscription more ambiguous. Here is remembered Theodoric, who murdered his brother and died from the wound. Let those who judge him remember we all carry blades, and fear decides where they cut. Students of history still debate the case. Was the prince responsible for his actions? Despite the manipulation, could the guard have done more to expose the conspiracy before it destroyed them? Should the historian have published documents that destabilized an already fragile regime? These debates miss what matters. The story isn't here about assigning blame or determining responsibility. According to some moral calculus, it's about recognizing a pattern that repeats throughout history. Fear makes us dangerous to what we love. Isolation makes us vulnerable to manipulation and the people who trade in fear and isolation. The dukes and bishops of every age profit from the ruins of bonds. He deliberately shattered. The modern world likes to believe we've evolved past such barbarities. We don't torture, we don't flay, we don't execute the innocent in underground chambers while princes watch from hiding. But we still weaponize fear, we still isolate leaders from honest counsel, we still manufacture evidence and manipulate paranoia, we still destroy trust and call it security. The methods are subtler: reputation destruction instead of physical torture, social isolation instead of literal chambers. But the pattern remains. And when historians of future centuries examine our age, they'll find the same story repeated: loyal people destroyed by the fearful, relationships shattered by manipulation, and societies impoverished by the loss of trust. The guard and the prince have been dead for 500 years, but their ghosts walk through every court, every government, every institution where power concentrates and fear metastasizes. They haunt every leader who must decide whom to trust. They shadow every loyal servant, wondering if their service will be rewarded or weaponized. There's no clean moral to this story, no simple lesson that makes the tragedy worthwhile. The guard died horribly. The prince died miserably. The kingdom fell apart. The conspirators eventually consumed each other in subsequent power struggles. Everybody lost. If there's anything to take from 5 centuries of retelling, it's this: loyalty matters, even when, especially when it costs everything. Truth matters even when, especially when it's uncomfortable, and fear, however justified, however reasonable, however carefully cultivated by those who benefit from it, will always whisper that the people who love us are actually the ones who destroy us. That whisper destroyed a prince and his guard. It's destroyed thousands before them, and thousands since. It will destroy thousands more unless we deeply learn to recognize the voice of manipulation dressed as wisdom. The prince learned this lesson in the worst way possible, watching his brother's skin peeled away while trying to convince himself it was necessary, then living with the knowledge of what age done for years of slow self-destruction. We can learn it more cheaply just by remembering their names. Their story and the universal pattern their tragedy reveals. The god's name was Marcus, the prince was Theodoric. They loved each other like brothers in a world that would not permit such dangerous honesty, and their story told and retold across centuries remains one question we still haven't answered when fear tells you to destroy what you love for the sake of security. How do you find the courage to refuse? The prince found that courage too late in a torture chamber filled with smoke and screaming, watching his brother die while trying to believe it was necessary. May we find it sooner, may we find it in time.